Okay, in this part, we're going to look at the graph and how does this relate to the graph. So here we have y equals x squared minus 4x minus 5. And if we want to solve the equation, notice we're setting y equal to 0. So how would you solve this equation? What would you do? What method would you use? Could you use the square root method here? In fact, you cannot. The reason why you can't is because you have a 4x in the middle. You can't use the square root method unless you can isolate that square. And if we were to move the 4x over, we would be taking the square root of x. That's not going to help us solve for x. So the easiest way to solve this is going to be to factor. So x times x gives us x squared, right? What times what gives us -5? And what do you notice about the signs? If it's a -5 that gets multiplied, tell me what the signs are going to have to be. Negative and a positive, because a negative times a positive gives you a negative, right? And then what would be the two numbers that multiply to -5 and add to -4? -5 and +1. And so that means x equals here. Good. And x equals here, -1. Now, let's talk about how this relates to the graph, okay? So we have a little graph over here, and it turns out when we set y equal to 0, y equals 0 is the equation of the x-axis, because right here at the middle, we call that the origin, 0, 0. If I don't go up or down, that means my y is equal to 0. So that's sort of an important concept to maybe memorize, is the x-axis is equal to y equals 0. The x-axis is equation. Does anybody know what the equation of the y-axis is? X equals 0. Because again, if I start out at the origin and I don't go over to +2 or -2, I stay here and I go up, all of the coordinates on the y-axis include x equals 0. So what are the x-intercepts of the graph? Well, it turns out the x-intercepts are where the graph hits the x-axis, right? That's where it intercepts. So it's going to be 5, 0, and -1, 0. That comes from the equation. Whenever you solve an equation, that means for x, and you set y equal to 0, you're in fact finding the x-intercepts. So the x-intercepts were -1, oops, -1 is over here, sorry, and +5, which is somewhere around here, right? Let's call this 5, 0, and this one -1, 0. Any idea what the y-intercept is? And this one is not. What's the y-intercept? And this relates sort of back to y equals mx plus b, the graph of a line. So it's actually, what would happen if you plug in x equals 0? What's left? The only thing left when you plug in x equals 0 is -5. So 0, -5 is down here. And then sketch the graph with the given axis, or on the given axis, and label at least 4 points. So there's also this thing called the Axis of Symmetry. You might remember that from Math 65 as well. Notice how from -1 over to +5, how many spaces are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 spaces. What's halfway in between -1 and 5? What number would be halfway in between those? 2. Because if I count over 1, 2, 3 from this direction and 1, 2, 3 from this direction, that means right here, cutting the parabola in half is x equals 2. X equals 2 we call the axis of symmetry. Okay? So if I have a point right here, 0, -5, that's 2 units away from the axis of symmetry. Where's the other point on the other side? Right here, right? So 4, -5 is the symmetrical point, Now a parabola, it kind of like curves around, okay? But there's also a vertex. The vertex is going to be the smallest or the largest point, or the minimum or the maximum point. In this case, this one is opening upward, so we have a minimum point. Any idea how I would find out what the coordinates of the vertex are? The vertex is going to be located on the axis of symmetry. How would I find that? You're going to plug something in. What if we plug in x equals 2? So to find the vertex, if we go y equals 2 squared minus 4 times 2 minus 5, we get 4 minus 8 minus 5, and I'd probably prefer to have my calculator do this, but can anyone tell me what that would be? -9? Yes? Is that what you got? The vertex is always on the axis of symmetry, yes. Okay, and so it's going to be down here at -9 if I did my math correctly. It looks right. And then we connect it to form this parabola. Okay, and so parabola has symmetry, and you might recall from Math 65, you could always use x equals -b over 2a. That's another way to find the axis of symmetry and the vertex. So let's just try that for a second. X equals -b over 2a. What's -b? It's going to be, yeah, -4. So -4 over, what's a? So we have 2 times 1, and that's 4 over 2, which is 2. You see that? X equals 2. We already just deduced from the fact that that was halfway in between that that's the axis of symmetry. Okay, and so the vertex is 2, -9. Now you can do all of this stuff on your calculator as well. So I'm just going to show you really quickly how you can enter this on your calculator. So if we go to y equals, the nice thing about your graphing calculator, well, it graphs. That's what makes it so fancy and so expensive, okay? So always you're going to press y equals, and then we're going to type in this equation. In order to use the x, there's a little x key right here. So we go x squared minus 4x minus 5. Oops, that's 4. Minus 5. That would be a different graph altogether. And if I press graph, then I'm going to see my parabola. I'm seeing that right now it's crossing at -1. That looks right. It's crossing at 5. It looks like it's crossing the y-axis at -5, and that's looking like the axis of symmetry. Now there's a lot of, I have some other videos on using the graphing calculator, but I'm just going to show you really briefly here. If you go second graph, you're going to see a table of values. And all of these points that we have plotted here, so the vertex, the x-intercepts, and the y-intercept, all of these points should be on our table of values. So right here we see there's -1, 0. You see that? That's my x and y coordinates. Here's 0, -5. 1, 8, we didn't plot that one, but it looks like 1, 8 would be like right here. 2, -9, that's our vertex we found. And then it turns around. 3, -8, because there's symmetry. There's the point, the symmetrical point to the y-intercept, which was 4, -5. And then if we curve back around, we have our other x-intercept, which is 5, 0. Okay, any questions on that? I'm going to also, I'll post some other videos I have on this, on using the graphing calculator, just in order to save time and efficiency. How'd that go? It didn't. Okay, well, I'll come over and we'll troubleshoot that. It's probably just a setting issue, okay?